Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Up Close on METV. I'm Charles Clapsaddle, station manager for Manatee Educational Television, and I want to begin this special edition with a question. What facility in our region adds more than $2.3 billion annually in economic impact and supports more than 24,000 jobs? Is the closest U.S. deepwater seaport to the Panama Canal with nearly 5,000 acres of surrounding green space for development? Well, if you answered Port Manatee, you would be exactly right. And today we're very pleased to have with us two individuals who can not only tell us about the growth and development of Port Manatee, but also its potential for the future. Joining us today is David McDonald. Mr. McDonald has been the director of Port Manatee from 1992 to 2012, and the new executive director, Mr. Carlos Buqueras. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate this, and this is really a privilege for METV to have both of you here to talk about probably what is one of the key elements in this community, Port Manatee. So David, if we could begin with you, to give us a brief history of Port Manatee and how it developed.
Well, Charles, the local founding fathers in Manatee County in the 1960s were looking for a way to create jobs and to bring international trade into the community. You know, we had an ancient history with Hernando de Soto and maritime industry, but this was to bring it up to current times and to, as our students were leaving high school or college, they were going outside of our community to find jobs, and so there was a need to find good paying jobs within Manatee County. And so they struck out on a feasibility study in the mid-1960s to see, was it feasible to have a deep water seaport in Manatee County, and could it be supported? Obviously, that was found to be favorable. And in the late 1960s, they began construction of Port Manatee, dredging a 40-foot deep channel from the main Tampa Bay Channel and creating the port itself, initially by dredging and then eventually with warehouses, etc., in order to attract cargo. And the very first cargoes that came into Port Manatee were petroleum, exporting phosphate or fertilizer products, and then importing plywood that came in from Korea. And so that really was the beginning of the port in the early 1970s when it opened. Since then, it's just been a continual development now, moving towards other cargoes, diversification, and going back to that original reason for having a seaport, to create jobs. One of the most important things that has been found recently is the value of a job at a Florida seaport. They found, and this was a study done by the state of Florida, where they found that a Florida seaport creates a job that on the average pays $15,000 a year more than white collar and blue collar combined. So when a seaport creates a job, it creates a good job, a job that a family can come to Manatee County or a surrounding community, that they can raise a family, that they can become part of the quality of life that we have here in our community, and they can help develop that quality of life.
Well, Florida is very fortunate that throughout the state there's a lot of ports. There's how many ports in general? 19?
Well, there's 14 now. There's actually a 15th one that is in the creation just to the north of us near Brooksville, Port Citrus. Oh. And so it's a little bit new on the horizon, and they're actually going through what we did back in the 1960s, and they're starting down the pathway of their feasibility study. But 14 operating seaports.
But Port Manatee is under your watch, has kind of positioned itself to be a strong and developing port. And I'd like for you to take a few minutes to talk about some of the innovations that have been out there. You dredged a new berth. And how important is that?
Well, it's extremely important. Understanding we're all in a recession now and things have quieted down, but you have to be ready to come out of that recession because these facilities take so long to design, permit especially, and then to construct. I mean, you're looking for an average deep water dock it could be anywhere from 6 to 8 to 10 years in that process. And companies out there don't have that much time to make a decision. You can't say to a major shipping line, if you'll sign up and sign a contract, in 10 years we'll have a dock for you. I mean, they're off to somewhere else. Yeah. So you have to be proactive, be thinking of the future, really have that, as I call it, that vision from 30,000 feet. And what I sat as the chairman of the Florida Ports Council, which is all 14 ports under one council in the state. And the 10 years that I was chairman, I really observed a lot of good things that happened at Florida's seaports over their development, and a lot of mistakes that were made. And probably one of the biggest mistakes was allowing urban sprawl to come in and choke the port, not taking control of land, not creating avenues or venues to get to the marketplace, because the most expensive form of transportation is by truck. Okay, your cheapest is by water, next by rail, and then by truck. And so if you don't plan for the future for that land-side transportation issue, and your trucking component becomes extremely costly, then these companies get back to just economics 101. It's time and money. And if it's cheaper and quicker to go through another port than your port, they're gone. And so that's what you have to plan for. Those facilities that will not only be there for their development so they can get the ship in, get it unloaded quickly, because that's the most expensive piece of the puzzle, but then get it to the marketplace and do that efficiently and cost effectively. And so by creating these we've put in now in the last few years 2,200 linear feet of new dock. That's a half a mile of new berthing, deep water berthing at the cost of about, well, over $10,000 a foot. So it's quite costly, but you can't go out and get the business if you don't have it.
But the dividends for that are going to pay off.
Absolutely. We're at the crossroads of that, and that's kind of where we're passing the baton now here over to Mr. Buqueras.
Well, I want to follow up on the point that you made with Mr. Buqueras. And sir, you've had a long and very successful history throughout Florida with ports, and you came from Port Everglades. Is that correct?
That's correct. South
and one of the things that David just mentioned is that that land is an essential component, for the development. And the question comes to mind, places like the Port of Miami, they're kind of locked in. They don't have a lot of room for development. What do you see as the potential for Port Manatee as it continues to kind of expand on the vision that is being implemented?
Well, just like David mentioned, that the fact that these ports are constrained by cities puts them at a disadvantage in terms of growth. And the fact that there is a conflict between residents and ports never really is a good match. A port such as Manatee that has a surrounding footprint of thousands of acres is a real economic driver of the future of the port. The connectivity with I-75, the future connector with I-75 puts the port in an ideal situation to grow the port and to make the port what it really is in most counties, the economic driver, the economic engine, not just for jobs, but international trade.
Well, one of the unique things, and perhaps both of you could be able to address this, that Port Manatee has developed is an enterprise zone. And that enterprise zone is there for growth and potential. David, could you tell us a little bit about what that enterprise zone is and what it will mean to the port?
Well, when the economy took a downturn, there were a lot of developers around the port that had large parcels of land that were going to be residential or light commercial. And with the downturn of that particular industry, that obviously wasn't going to be a thing of the near future anyway. And so really the authority caught on with the idea of the encouragement zone and enterprise zone, and they decided to incentivize through the powers that they have as county commissioners. And so that your viewers know, it's the 7 county commissioners in Manatee County that then sit separately as a 7-member port authority. Every port is made up a little bit different throughout the state. Some are city governments, some are county commissions, and the port is actually a department of the county commission. Ours is a bit different. We're a dependent special district. And so that gave them the ability to view the potential for creating opportunity by giving incentives, tax incentives, development incentives, rapid turnaround on permitting, et cetera, to private industries that would come in and develop in and around the port, so that unlike some of the port that you mentioned or other ports that have become really almost suffocated by urban growth, the development ring around the port would be port friendly. It would be, you know, medium, light, even some heavy industrial, but it would be those types of jobs that then facilitate a port, and a port in turn facilitates them. So it was really quite a clever idea. I think a lot of ports have talked about an inland port, but most of those go quite a ways inland, you know, 30, 40, 50 miles in some cases. To have one at the port's front door and to incentivize it. We have 2 international businesses now that have located across the street, one importing fertilizer products, another importing solar salt that's made into water softeners and also chlorides, and they're every day hunting for more businesses. So it's been, I think, a unique opportunity, and I think Carlos is going to have a lot of fun developing that little sandbox, as we, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 acre sandbox, and helping, because this is where seaports cross the line, and from that government component that we're structured under, we can reach out and assist the private enterprise that then bring, you know, the large quantities of jobs to the area and to Manatee County as a whole. So it's well on its way, and I think if we see, and we're starting to see just a twinge of the turn of this economy, I think there's going to be some rapid, movement out there.
Which brings me to my next question, is that the lifeblood of a port is the tenants and the services that you bring in there. Let's take a moment, if we can, and talk about some of the tenants. Now Gulf Stream natural gas was a major component where they came in and developed. But there's a lot, as well as Del Monte, which is a major tenant for the organization. Can you talk a little bit about the tenants and the type of tenants that the port wants to bring in and that development? Well,
I'll talk just a bit about it, and then I'll pass it to Carlos, because Carlos, this is an area of expertise that he brings to the port, and I think it's just the right timing. What we've been able to do is put the facilities into the port now. The port has actually been, we've increased the capacity of the port by over 50% in just the last couple of years, in the way of docks, in the way of warehouses, in the way of upland facilities, and jointly we just were able to get the authority to move forward on the next phase, and that is the completion of Berth 12 and the first phase of the upland container storage area. You mentioned a couple of our tenants, and those, Kinder Morgan is another very large one, Martin Marietta. We have some very, Tropicana brings through subsidiaries a lot of its product through the port, as does Minute Maid and others. And so Florida Power and Light gets all of its fuel. Its parish power plant, 100% of the fuel comes through Port Manatee, whether it's 6 oil or natural gas, as you mentioned with Gulf Stream natural gas. So those are very important anchor core tenants that bring product through the port. Now what we've been trying to do is position the port to diversify even further. And that's as we move more into containers and more into break bulk commodities. Those actually create more jobs than a bulk commodity does. The bulk commodity is kind of the foundation, and then these others begin to build on that. And so with that, that's what really been Carlos's primary area of expertise when he was at Port Everglades, and he brings that now to Port Manatee, and he's got these assets now to really develop and bring those new companies in. And so I'll let him speak to maybe some of the ideas that he brings with him for the future of the port.
Well, David is absolutely right. Most ports, including Port of Miami, Port of Palm Beach, Jacksonville, and others, Tampa, have started as bulk handling ports. Raw materials, which is essentially what the local hinterland, the local community needed to build the facility. Once you go up, let's say, that food chain, you develop into, let's say, higher use opportunities, containers, maybe some passenger services, maybe some other types of facilities that encourage a far-reaching international trade. And as David said, it creates even better paying jobs. So the next step really is to take all those assets that David has put in place over the last 20 years and to really maximize their use globally, looking beyond our backyard, looking into Latin America, Central America, Caribbean, Europe, maybe the Far East. But we're not going to leave any stone unturned. We're going to go after every opportunity that we have to develop the port, and we're going to look at every opportunity and deal that's put before us, and some that we could help work with other companies, existing customers or new customers, to take the port even further.
Now, recently at a port meeting, a Port Manatee meeting, one of the questions, one of the comments that came up, that container shipping is a growth field. It's going to become the way that most ports will be able to maximize their potential. And we want to get into the Panama Canal in a moment, but container shipping is a huge component of the shipping trade. Correct? And how is Port Manatee kind of developing that? I know that they have the, what is it, Big Joe, the crane, which we were there taping on the unveiling, and now you're looking for another crane to help maximize that?
Well, we have purchased a second crane. We have, you have to show the industry that you're a real player, and obviously you have to have the dock in the deep water, which we now have. And you have to have the craneage, which we now have 2 of the largest mobile harbor cranes in the world. Brand new. This was a public-private partnership between us, the Port Authority, and one of our stevedoring companies. And they've been utilizing it. Now, there's a lot of capacity there, so we can utilize it, and they've been utilizing it for containers and for some break bulk. So there's a lot of opportunity there as that grows, and we think that containers are an area that this part of the Gulf, the Tampa Bay area, can really excel in. Trade lanes are changing, you mentioned that. The Panama Canal opening in 2014, the deeper locks, that will have an impact. It's yet to be seen how large the impact is, but it'll have an impact on trade lanes as shipping lines look to come into the Gulf that were restricted because of draft before then. But don't forget, South America is Florida's largest trading partner. 9 out of our 10 largest foreign trading partners are Latin American countries. 9 out of 10, Brazil being the largest. And we do a lot of trade with Brazil right now in forest products, aluminum, lumber, orange juice, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity there that I think for growth. So while the canal is very important, and we want to stay focused on that, and we want to keep our partnership alive and well, I think Carlos, with his background in the Latin Americas, is going to really be able to expand and perhaps exploit and bring those markets into the Gulf rather than letting them go up to the Atlantic. And I think you were in Brazil recently with the governor. I went down there for that trade mission. And that
was part of the EDC, Economic Development Trade Mission that went down?
Yes, and with Enterprise Florida and the governor's office.
Very important to develop, because isn't Brazil one of the largest growing, fastest growing economies in the world?
Yeah, and they're actually, I think, right now one of the strongest economies in this worldwide recession that we find ourselves in. Brazil seems to have been able to skirt that, and so expanding our markets, because we already have several ships calling into Brazil. on a regular basis. Now, I wouldn't say a liner service, which is a regular schedule, and for your viewing audience, a liner service is like an airline. You know it's going to be there at a certain day at a certain time, etc. And then you have what we call tramp service, which is more of a, less scheduled, but still routine to a certain extent, once a month, twice a month, something like that, but not necessarily that structured. So those services are already in existence. So companies that might be looking to Brazil to bring cargo up, particularly break bulk cargo, and break bulk cargo are things that are in boxes, pallets, etc., usually in fairly large quantities. Right. Or it could be steel, or it could be lumber packaged in bundles. Those that are looking that way, there are already services that exist that they can put their cargo on and bring it into the port.
Well, you've touched on an important subject with the Panama Canal, and I'd just like to cover that kind of thoroughly, because with the development of the Panama Canal, we're looking at huge new ships that will be able to transverse the canal now. Larger capacity, larger cargoes. Where do you see, and you already have a memorandum of understanding with the government of Panama, and was one of the signatures that has developed. Where is the Panama Canal? How important a part is that going to play?
Well, I think it's very important in that it is going to change, as I said before, some trade lanes and some trade strategies. It's yet to be seen. There's a few very key things that have to occur between now and 2014. The canal zone operators have got to set the tariff rates, and that's going to make up a lot of shippers' minds whether they use the canal or they stay on the West Coast and they rail it. And the railroads aren't going to just let this out of their cold finger, their finger. They're going to have a grip on this because
of bidding.
Right. Well, because so the public understands those ships come into Oakland, California, or L.A. Long Beach, or other ports on the West Coast, and then they meet what we call unit trains. It could be 60 to 80 car trains that then haul that cargo all the way across the country, to the Midwest into Chicago, to the Northeast up into the the New York metropolitan area. Right. And if that cargo comes through the canal and into the Gulf and the Atlantic, those railroads have lost that revenue. So they're not going to just give up. This isn't going to be just a cakewalk. And so, but I think there is, when we get back to even close to our previous trade imports and exports, there is a significant amount of cargo yet that could come through. And I would anticipate the big, what we'll call post-Panamax ships. Now, you're talking ships that draft close to 50 feet and probably getting at a LOA, length overall, of over 1,000 feet. Those are really too big to come into any Florida port today. Miami's trying to gear up to that, but any Florida port. So they would most likely go to a Caribbean port and transload onto a feeder vessel, a smaller vessel, one in the 700 to 800 foot, still a big ship, still 3 football fields long, but smaller, for ports like Manatee and Tampa. Now, Manatee is still, at this point, one of the deepest draft ports in the state of Florida at 41 feet. So, and Carlos, has got a lot of experience in the Latin Americas when he worked with Port Everglades, and so he brings that experience now as he looks not just to Panama, but to Colombia. The trade, the federal government just released some and adopted some trade policies with not only Panama, but with Colombia in our hemisphere, also South Korea. That's yet to be seen what kind of impact. That'll take a little bit of time, a year or two, to kind of see what kind of impact does that have when all of a sudden we're not charging the duties that we were charging before between those countries.
Correct.
Okay, so that promotes jobs over there, but it also promotes, it hopefully lifts their economy to where they're buying U.S. goods. And creates a trade just like NAFTA did with Mexico and Canada. And so there's a lot of exciting things on the horizon here, and I think Carlos is going to have a great time, you know, figuring all the various strategies out, but he brings with him the credentials to do that.
Well, Ms. Buqueras, you know, now that you have this, and these are opportunities, these are across the board opportunities, what do you see as the most critical mission that you need to fulfill as you move into next generation?
I think there are several missions, you know, because we just don't want to be a one commodity port. So we are going to have to promote the port for containers, infrastructure, warehousing, distribution, logistics, perhaps some ferry services to islands in the Caribbean that might become trading partners in the near future, if they do, and some other types of commodities. So a port that diversifies its infrastructure and its customer base is better able to adapt to changing economic conditions. And truly, as David pointed out, Latin America is our backyard. And as such, as he said, is that really 80% of our trade is north-south, whether it's Port Everglades or Miami or us. And that opportunity is that while Europe is going through a major recession, the Far East to some degree, Latin America has been pretty steady, nothing dramatic, no huge growth except for Brazil, but they've been solid partners. And to capitalize on that, to further perhaps point out a fact, is that Florida has a over $2 billion trade surplus with Brazil.
That's amazing.
And that trade surplus, every $200,000 of that trade surplus equals one full-time job. So you divide 2 billion by 200,000, and you get a lot of jobs just related to Brazil. And overall, that's the whole thing target, to be an export surplus port. And of course, you know, trade, as they say, is a two-way road. So you can't pick and choose if we're going to be just exports. But to promote more exports, to be able to handle it, and at the end of the day, what customers are looking for is a port of entry into the U.S. that really gives them access to the entire country. And as such, for example, the CSX, the rail, comes right into Port Manatee. The port has its own rail line that connects with the CSX, and then the CSX can take us really anywhere in the country without having to go any further for special commodities, for bulk, for container commodities. So the port really has a tremendous advantage with having its rail right there and direct, unimpeded access as compared to South Florida or Southeast Florida, where you have to, you know, go to the Florida East Coast, and then you have to connect either to the CSX or to the Norfolk Southern. Here we have unimpeded straight shot.
That was one of the things that you mentioned, is that time is money. So the quicker that ship can come in, unload, and have access to those other modalities to move around, it's going to be good for business.
Absolutely, and you know, I think as you look to the future, and we look kind of to the U.S. itself, the next opportunity, as Carlos was talking about rail, is going to be reaching up into the Midwest. Now, we already move a lot of product up into the Northeast by rail. A lot of it comes in from Brazil, goes to our orange juice processors, and they move a lot of that by their own trains up into the Northeast. So there's a route established right now. But into the Midwest, it's all got to be truck. And so that's one of the opportunities that's being studied right now, to get up into the Chicago, you know, Indiana, Indianapolis area, and have two-way trade by rail. That allows that particular region then to almost do what the West Coast ports were successful in over the last couple of decades, in an east-west trade coming into the west coast of California and Washington, and moving cargo across the U.S. in an eastward bound way. It mimics that, but it takes trade now coming out of the South Americas, and it allows us to move that up into the Midwest in a north-south rail corridor. And we have been successful in the past in doing that by truck, because a lot of commodities come from the Midwest down into Florida, and then those truck drivers are looking for a backhaul. And so you can get a very good rate going back north, and we've been able to take advantage, and that's why we've been able to build that trade from Brazil in particular and Argentina. But rail eventually, once the volume gets there, then rail will be able to offer the more compatible rate and really be able to bring those products up in the Midwest at a cheaper rate and bring them down here for export also at a cheaper rate.
Well, gentlemen, I'm very privileged to have both of you here today, and we're kind of winding down. I want to give each one of you a sort of an opportunity to fully explore, and we're going to end with Mr. McDonald, and we're going to go to you, Mr. Buqueras. What do you see as the vision ahead? What are those key elements that you would like to see develop from the strength and the advantages that the port already has?
I think the key point to the port is to have essentially a solid base that is built around economic viability, it's built around jobs, and it's built around the environment. And we need to balance those three to make sure that the port is contributing to the local economy, becomes the economic driver, is environmentally sensitive, and also essentially is profitable to an extent that it has sufficient amount of money to reinvest and further build upon itself. So really those are the three key components.
And one of the key things you just mentioned is the environment. Port Manatee has a great reputation of being a good steward of the environment. And I want you to briefly talk about that if you can, Mr. McDonald. But as we wind down now, 20 years is a wonderful career, and Manatee County is very lucky to have had an individual as a kind of steward of Port Manatee over those past. I'm sure all 20 years haven't been like a bed of roses, but you've done a wonderful job, and I think all the kudos from the community are so well deserved. But if you can, give us a moment about what you would like this community to know about what you've accomplished with Port Manatee.
Well, I'll follow up first on my retirement, and one of the things I told the Port Authority members the other day, I thanked them for allowing me to have the best job in Manatee County for the past 20 years. Because every day we're dealing with companies all over the world. We're dealing with international, the international flavor of it all. And where else can you go where you look out across Tampa Bay from your office and you get to play with ships and trains and trucks and tugboats all day, you know? So it's been quite an interesting career. Actually, it goes back 36 and a half years. The last 20, as you said, as the executive director. And so I couldn't have asked for a better career here in Manatee, and to stay here in Manatee County as well. You know, I think the port's potential is just phenomenal. I use the term catapult. I think the port is ready to catapult into this next economy. We're not just drifting into it. The facilities are there. There is 50% more capacity than there was when we were running 8 to 9 million tons of cargo through the port. And so really, you know, now it's just as the economy turns and as new business is eyeing the port. So Manatee County residents know the top 5 shipping lines in the world have been to our port in the last 6 months. And several of them have come back for a second and third look. So we're on their planning horizon. You know, the worldwide shipping lanes are all kind of in flux right now, and everybody's trying to see how it settles out and kind of get through this storm, this economic storm that everyone's found itself in. But I think the good news is that the port has been able to kind of, you know, through these troubled waters, has been able to stay on a steady course and accomplish getting those facilities in place. And I think you know, Carlos is going to have a very interesting and enjoyable tenure as well at the port as he then brings some of those companies in that we seek. And he brought up an interesting one. I'll touch on it a little bit. and that is ferry service. We shied away from that after 9/11 because we had a cruise line, as most people know, the Regal Empress, and people loved that line, but she couldn't withstand the economic downturn after 9/11. And security became such a daunting component of seaports' survival when it came to cruise passengers coming and going. And we took a position, kind of a wait-and-see position on that, because the cost just did not benefit, bringing in, benefit the area, bringing in or going after another line or going after a ferry service. That changed dramatically in last year's legislative session. The Florida legislature realized that Florida and Florida seaports were being hampered with a double overlapping security component that was not benefiting security, and that the federal government had now ramped up to where security across the country was being implemented. And so they removed some of those heavy restrictions that allow a seaport to go after a 1 or 2 cruise or ferry operation. And if you haven't seen the ferry boats in Europe, they are as nice as a cruise ship these days. It's just the lower decks you can move cargo. So it really becomes quite opportunistic when we're talking about Caribbean travel and moving goods and services and commodities to and from there, while passengers are also making their way. And so that is on the horizon. That's back on the table now, and I think that's and that's something that Carlos was responsible for and did a very good job of at Port Everglades, and so he brings that talent with him too. So I think there's some very exciting things that are about to happen. And one subject matter that has always been a bit controversial, and that's Cuba. It's controversial for many reasons. We don't need to go into them. I think everybody understands them. But there will come a time, I believe, where the political atmosphere is to a point that we can recreate trade with Cuba. That's a nation to the south of us that's almost the same population as Florida, almost the same size as Florida, but is in dire need of goods and services and jobs within their communities and within their country. And so I have to believe, and I think Carlos agrees, there will come a time when the political oppositions between our two nations come together. We've seen that in if we can do that in Vietnam, certainly if we can do that in China, then there's opportunity at a certain time that trade will open up. And so here we are, Port Manatee, the closest port, believe this or not, in the United States to Mariel. Now, Miami is a little closer to Havana, a couple miles, that's all. So and this region has a historic past of trade with Cuba. Tampa was one of Cuba's biggest trading partners back in the 1800s and early 1900s. And so that, along with the other Caribbean nations, along with the Central American and Mexico and the Central American countries, I think ferry operations have a bright future, and I think that you're going to see that in the coming years. So it's something to look forward to, I think.
And I think that's an important point to make, and we would welcome the opportunity for Mr. Buqueras to come back, perhaps with some of his staff, and talk about these other markets that might be developing towards the future. I think Port Manatee is very lucky not only to have an individual like David over 20 years, but to Buqueras to carry us into the next generation. As we wind down, gentlemen, first of all, I want to thank you very much for doing this. The invitation is open as issues are developed with the port, successes and challenges ahead. We'd welcome the opportunity to invite you back to discuss those so this community can find out more about a vital part of Manatee County, and that's Port Manatee.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and a special thanks to both of these gentlemen for joining us and for their years of dedication and service. Mr. McDonald is truly a major factor in developing the port. We want to thank you for joining us on this special edition of Up Close on METV.
Thank you.
Hey, Charles. Carlos.